Well, hello. Welcome back to our book study on Richard Foster's prayer. We are, of course, in chapter 9 and looking at the prayer of rest. Now, I specifically chose this one because I think our culture and our society right now is so predicated on busyness, as maybe you've heard me say before. And so rest often doesn't feel very natural to us, which is kind of one of the funny things about kind of where we find ourselves in our world today. I say funny, but it's really not very funny for many of us. It's quite serious, actually. I think for most of us, our natural state is not one of rest, it is one of busyness. And so rest, whenever we talk about it, we end up talking about it in this way about what you have to do in order to get to rest. And that's kind of a tricky thing about talking about rest. Whenever we say we need to rest more, it's about what we have to do in order to get ourselves into that place of being at rest. And so it becomes easier to be in that more natural state, which is busyness for so many of us. And that's a problem. So I picked this chapter because not only because I think it's a necessary part of our spiritual lives. In fact, I think rest is really the foundation on which our spiritual lives rest, which seems counterintuitive, but I think it's very true. But not only because of that did I pick it, but because I think it presents to us a challenge in how we think about rest. Because again, I think because we're in this natural state of busyness, we think about rest as a chore. We think about rest as something else we have to do rather than a grace, rather than a mercy, rather than something that comes to us because we're beloved by God. Something that God desires for us, something that is a part of who we are and who we're made to be. That's sort of not really a way we think about rest. It's something that I am made to do. We think about rest as doing what we do outside of doing the thing we were made to do. We were made to work. We were made to, be a parent or a husband or a wife or whatever it is. We were made to be those things and do all the things that are necessary for that. And we rest when we're not doing those things. But what if we thought about rest in a way of thinking that God has made me to rest? God has created me. God has a purpose for me. And a part of that is to rest. We might think about rest a little differently, I hope, and begin to see how rest does function as something of that foundation of our spiritual life. And a part of why this chapter comes at this point is because at this point in the book, Foster is changing or kind of shifting the dynamic from that internal perspective to now the external, the movement away from the self and out into the world. And so, of course, we know that if we're not resting in ourselves, if we're not at rest and experiencing rest in our lives, it's very hard to give of ourselves. That's something you don't have to be in ministry or any other kind of helping profession to recognize that. To recognize that rest is what helps you be at your best. And so we want to think about rest a little bit differently as we come into this chapter. But I want to also start from the very end of this chapter in Foster's prayer on the page 103 in chapter 9. He says at the very end of the prayer, he asks God to help me to walk in your steps, teach me to see only what you see, to say only what you say, and to do only what you do. Now that, I think for us sometimes as Lutherans, may seem like a bit of a strange prayer. You may hear me and other pastors or theologians or such that you may listen to talk about being Christ-like. And that seems kind of like a strange concept maybe because it seems as if we're talking about myself becoming like God. And how does that work? And doesn't that seem a bit heretical? And all of these other questions might come up immediately when we talk that way. But really, it's important to remember that the whole point, the whole thrust of the Christian life, of the spiritual life, is to be like Jesus, to be more like Jesus as much as we can be. And so when Foster prays this, I want us to also think about this not in ways of thinking the ways that we're not like Jesus, but in all of the ways that we can be like Jesus. All of the ways that we might be able to reach out into our world and actually really, truly do just as Jesus would do, and say just as Jesus would say, and see that world just as Jesus would see it. And now, how does this correspond with rest? And here again, I think it's where we begin. We begin by resting. We begin by being in that place of being able to just drop the shoulders and relax, and being able to sit in the presence of God and know that, as he kind of gives this image at the end of being cupped in the hand like a baby bird. And I think that's such a beautiful image of God holding us. When he talked about this, I thought about the cupping of the hands when we come to take communion at the rail, and we put our hands together. We kind of cup them together to receive the bread or the wafer. And I think that to me, has always been an image of faith. When we come to the rail, we extend our hands knowing that something is going to get placed in there. The bread will be placed into our hands. We don't have to do anything. We don't have to say anything special. We just come and hold out our hands. And I think that's faith. I think that's a wonderful image of faith. And I think in the same way, when we come to rest, we can think of it similarly. We can think of it in the way that we are just holding out ourselves, and God will fill, and God will be there. We just hold out in expectation that God will be there. And when we begin to do that, when we begin to start from that place, we might begin to see God becoming more active and more real in our lives. We might be able to see then how Jesus comes forward in our speaking, in our looking into the world, in our actions. So I mentioned, I want to start there because I don't want us to too quickly dismiss that sort of idea and say, well, maybe some people can get there, but not me. No, it's important for us to begin in this place of rest and deep breathing, and just simply say, God is with me, and I can hold out my entire being, knowing that God will fill me, and God will be present. And then as I move out into the world, God will be present there too. So when we talk about rest, we are talking about faith. We are talking about trust. We are talking about, again, the very beginning, if you will, of our spiritual lives. So don't be too quick to dismiss rest, and don't be too quick to dismiss yourself in relation to your place in God's kingdom, in your place in God's story. The last thing I want to touch on is really just throughout this chapter, Foster kind of demonstrates his dialogue with God in certain areas, especially in the beginning of the chapter. He talks about kind of being out in this secluded space and wanting to get up constantly to go back because he's got something he thinks he needs to take care of, and he keeps hearing these words of be still, rest, and shalom, which means peace. And I'm curious what people might think of that, because he, in a couple of places, he demonstrates this sense of like hearing a thought or a word, something comes into his mind, and he follows it, fully convinced that that's God with him. And maybe that's a new concept for us. Maybe that's something new to us. Maybe we don't hear God in that way. But I wonder what it might be like if we tried listening to God in that way. It might be foreign, and it might not be for all of us. But I encourage you to kind of think more about that, and to kind of think about yourself in relation to it. Putting yourself in Foster's shoes and thinking, well, what kind of thoughts would I be having, and how would I know that it's the Spirit of God talking to me, and how could I trust it? And kind of think about that a little bit more, and kind of wonder with me what that might look like in your life. And as you do, maybe something comes up, and again, maybe you just simply find that's not really how I relate to God, and that's perfectly fine. But maybe you find there's something different there, and there's something new and something worthwhile to explore. So, as always, I hope that as you're reading this book, you're finding some gold nuggets, if you will, along the way. You're finding some ways of relating in your prayer life to God, and you're finding some new things about yourself even. Next week we'll be in chapter 10, Sacramental Prayer. And just a heads up, the week after that, so 2 weeks from this week, we'll do 2 chapters at once. We'll do 2 chapters 13 and 14. So just so you're ready for that. So chapter 10 next week. Week after that, chapters 13 and 14 together. Because they're kind of similar, so I thought I'd just push them together. So I hope you have a blessed weekend and blessings to you in this continued study and this continued endeavor of prayer. And God be with you until we see each other again.